How do we watch the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City? Welcome to the Virtual Jewel Box podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. I'm Scott Black, Director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and today I'm joined by three of the participants in our recent symposium, How we watch the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. Marcie Cancio, Clinical Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Utah and Director of Amplify Utah. Renato Olmedo-González, who is Public Arts Program Manager for the Salt Lake City Arts Council, and Jordan Rullo, Clinical Health Psychologist and Certified Sex Therapist and Adjunct Assistant Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Utah. Welcome, Marcie.
Thanks for having us, Scott.
Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you for having us.
And welcome, Renato.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to take the mic from Scott here, and we're going to dive in. We were just having a little bit of a conversation about how these podcasts are most fun when you feel like you're eavesdropping on a conversation. So like we're all out at brunch or a bar, and we have just watched the latest reunion or the latest episode. And we're like, oh my gosh, that was crazy. So that's the energy we're going to try to bring here. Full disclosure, we're recording on a Tuesday morning, so it's a little bit of an energy vibe to hit, but we're going to do it. So let's start out. 2.5 weeks ago, we had the symposium, How We Watch, with the Tanner Humanities Center on the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. What are some of your, the memories that first pop into your head? What you take away from that day?
Well, I think the biggest thing for me, the Salty Hose, their talk, which, I don't even know how much I want to say about their talk. It was maybe a little bit controversial, but they were basically saying where all the housewives would go based on LDS religion, where they would go when they die.
This was fascinating because it was like, where do they go in the hierarchy of heaven,
Yes.
right? Celestial kingdom, terrestrial kingdom, outer darkness. And it was rooted just based simply on their housewifiness. Like, are they married? Do they have kids? Are they continue to be married? Are they divorced? And it was rooted strictly on that. No other religious kind of components, but it was very, I think, spicy.
It's very spicy.
Yeah.
Very spicy. And I did notice all the coverage after the conference, like in the Trib, and no one mentioned the Salty Hose in their talk. Even though it was an amazing, entertaining talk, it was not mentioned frequently, I think, because it was quite spicy.
Yeah, they hit into a lot of the kind of taboos of faith, which was really interesting. And there were a lot of chuckles and a lot of kind of uncomfortable chuckles, which is, I think, a really good indication that when you make people uncomfortable in conversations, sometimes that's really good. But I think addressing it in a news aspect is a little bit more challenging when you have maybe 800 words to tell a story.
I do love that they put themselves. They put themselves in whatever, I don't know what the terminology, kingdom, planet.
They went kind of meta in their own talk. They're both divorced women, former members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, academics, both are professors at Salt Lake Community College. So really kind of tapping into a lot of the things that this show kind of embodies, right? Like this struggle with faith, with dating, with relationships, what that looks like, what that means to be a noble and a good Mormon, while also balancing career and intelligence and all of these components. It was fascinating. And they totally came out wearing the blue coats from The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives and long wigs. But Claire Adams already has this beautiful long hair. And when she took off her wig, everyone was like, did she take the wig off? It's pretty funny. But kind of leaned into the other pop culture moments with the other show. Yeah. Renato, what stood out to you? What's like one of your big takeaways from the day?
Besides all the learning, I think some of my favorite moments, it was right at the beginning, there was some tech issues for playing Britney's video at the beginning. And then people themselves started talking. Someone said Meredith's line from, I think, 2 seasons ago, like, jealousy is a disease. And like everybody just started laughing. So it was like a huge feeling of community, even though people weren't introduced. The thing wasn't even set up yet. The symposium wasn't even started, but people laughed and that just came naturally. So I really enjoyed that because it really set the tone and the mood for How We Watch Salt Lake.
Yeah, agreed. It was a real community vibe. And there were so many inside jokes that people just kind of laughed about. But there were a lot of folks here who have never seen The Housewives. I think it was largely for viewers of the show and for fans of the show. But I know that a dean at one of the colleges came here, came to the symposium, and she said it was fantastic. She loved your talk, Jordan, which we're going to get into more in a little bit. But it really hit for a lot of audiences. But I agree that community aspect, that kind of appreciation of local culture and just kind of the humor of the show. Because I don't think a lot of people watch reality TV and think comedy, think that it's funny. But the things that we quote, the things that we remember from it are hilarious and sometimes like just outrageously so. An evil eye patch, not knowing how you got a black eye, meeting your husband at the airport in an inflatable costume, talking voice of an Osmond or a Timu Osmond, as this whole team called Jared Osmond, talking stuffed animal with his voice that gets thrown overboard during a yacht trip. I mean, this stuff is wild, right? It's a reason that we watch this. So I want to, before we get into a little bit of, we had so many amazing sessions at this symposium, from a session on babies and AI, replicating some of the scenes of the show, academic talks about relationships, which Jordan's going to dive into a little bit more. We had, what else did we have? My brain's so fried. We had a whole slate of incredible panels and incredible sessions. Oh my gosh, we talked about crickets. We talked about crickets, right? And if you know anything about Utah history, the Mormon crickets, the lore where the crickets were eating all of the fields and the Mormons were certainly going to die of starvation. And then the seagulls swooped in and ate all the crickets. And this is why the California gull is now Utah's state bird, right? There was even a crickets conversation from a scientist who studies crickets from Yale, right? From Connecticut. Yeah, all the way from Yale. Came out to join the symposium. Oh, great. There was a great talk on cult cinema and drawing parallels between the cult classics that we like to watch and likening that to the Real Housewives. There was so much great academic content here. But then there was also silliness and tomfoolery with wigs and bonnets and inflatable shark costumes that some fool wore on stage.
Live action dramatization.
Right, yeah. Dramatic readings, which were so fun. And people ate all this up. They loved the silliness of it. But also, to Renato's point, there was so much learning, right? People were eating up what they were learning. So before we move on to this conversation, what was one thing that you learned, Jordan?
I'm still blown away by the salty hose. That is just, I'm not from here. I'm not from Utah, so I don't know. I mean, I know a bit, but I was just like, wait, yeah. So, I mean, I just keep coming back to that. That is the one talk that blew me away.
Where are you from?
I'm from Chicago.
Okay. Yeah. So and that's one of those things where if you bring that curiosity lens, which is why the Tanner Humanities Center did this, because curiosity is the heart of humanities, right? So you can come into this and be like, I don't really understand all of these kingdoms. But maybe you leave here and you're like, I want to go learn more, right?
Yeah.
Like, and this is the magic of the Real Housewives, is encouraging us to learn more about this place where we live.
Culture, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I would add, this isn't necessarily learning, but there was a lot of, I would say I felt very validated. And I think, Ronto, you said this, something like, I watch it and I know it's trashy, but I love it and it makes me feel good. You said something like that, and it's like, oh, these are my people.
Yeah, like
'Cause,
the going home after work. You know, you can be
Yes,
doing
yes.
something during your 9 to 5 or whatever you do for work. And in my case, I try to link it to, like, it could be considered like more high culture or proper culture or worthy culture. And then you go home, and then I do something that a lot of the people that would appreciate that, or not everyone, like a public art is for everybody, but they wouldn't necessarily tie the two together.
Yes.
And I think it problematizes maybe my own identity. But there is something valid about what we do after work. I mean, I don't criticize people for going and watching sports, but I link it to the same thing. You know, it's
Yeah.
a form of watching TV entertainment. It's very personal. It's a very personal thing to be entertained.
Well, those are the things that drive us. Those are, I mean, some people talk about work all the time, and sometimes depending on what's going on, but we don't want to talk about work constantly. These are the things where the conversation lives, where the connection happens, where the bonding of a culture happens. And here at the U, I also teach a course called Media and Society. It's an intro-level general education humanities class where we look at all of our mass mediums and how it plays into how we interact as a society. And we talk about culture as a skyscraper, right? That in your top levels, your 50th, 60th floor of the skyscraper, you have like Finnegan's Wake and Hamlet and Othello and Odyssey, all this stuff that is considered really quote unquote smart. And then as you go further and further down the skyscraper, you get lesser and lesser kind of like high culture. And then when you get to the bottom levels, this is where you have your reality TV.
I was just going to ask you, where is reality TV?
Real Housewives is right at the bottom.
Is it the basement or is it like the lobby?
Maybe the lobby.
Okay.
Like, I don't know if it's down with the furnace. But I think that based on these conversations, based on symposiums, based on the way that we can break it down, we could maybe take it up to like the 12th floor, right?
Wow.
I don't know, depending on how you want to approach it. That's probably the highest I would go. But you can think about culture as a skyscraper, right? And what do you want to be talking about? Do you always want to be operating at the highest possible level, talking about macroeconomics, right? I wouldn't even know how to get into that conversation. That's not where we want to spend our time talking. We want to be talking about how did Heather Gay get that black eye? We want to be talking about, does Lisa really have 7 attorneys when she's 7 on the Sprinter van, right? We want to be talking about those things. Those are the fun things. So let's get into a little bit more deeper into the 2 things that you guys talked about. Renato was on a panel that was really kind of the embodiment of how we watch, talking about the local culture and talking about how we watch this show as Utahns versus people who might be watching it from across the country or don't really know anything about Utah other than what they've seen in pop culture in the news media. And then Jordan did an incredible session or presentation called I'm Disengaging. And as a therapist, I actually broke down how these women engage on the show. And it was truly one of the highlights of the symposium. The feedback that we got showed everyone just really loving this. I want to go back and watch it again because it was so delightful. So we're going to do that. That's how we're going to jump into the rest of the show. So Renato, let's start with you. Break down before we got started, we were having a conversation about what it means to watch this as Utahns. Break down your thought on that. What does watching Real Housewives look like as someone who is from here, maybe someone who was born and raised here versus someone who is a transplant here like yourself, or watching it from kind of like through a fish tank from further away?
Yeah, I think for me, someone that's not from Utah, I moved here when I was 15. So I think I'm fascinated a lot by what happens here in culture. Also, the mainstream religion, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they have their own very specific culture, set of beliefs that I, as an outsider, I'm really interested in. You know, it's my neighbors, it's people that live in my community. And there's a lot of lore and a lot of secrets. Like, you know, you talk about Salt Lake City and then there's tunnels underground. And you go to the crickets that we were mentioning earlier, like all of those things. So as someone that has been watching Housewives for a long time, I started in high school watching Orange County. I think it became a character trait when New York Housewives came out. And then ever since then, I watched pretty much all of them except for a couple that I just wasn't interested. Anyways, when it was first announced that Salt Lake City was going to get its own Housewives, it became a reason to be somewhat proud of Salt Lake and like where we were on the map, and also just how some crazy delusional things that you see in the state and how that was going to be on TV. And I found myself wanting, before the show even came out, wanting to compare it to what it would be like. You know, are they going to go shopping? Like, we don't have the same shopping here. We don't have those like big stores that they have. Now we do, a couple. So part of that fascination started then. When the show came out, I think it really hit on multiple things that make our state and make our community. I think they did a wonderful job at casting this show with the different housewives that represent different facets of who we are as a community in general. From Lisa Barlow being a Mormon 2.0, Jack Mormon, which is, you know, cold, but then she coined another term for it. Heather Gay, who is probably more mainstream Mormon that you were familiar with leaving the church. Whitney Wild Rose being someone that you could tell she was Mormon, but only in name. And then she's just Whitney Wild Rose.
And accent. Her Utah
accent.
Her Utah affect is like perfect.
Even Jen Shaw, now that we're not supposed to speak about her, that was, I think, a casting that really made the show quite unique and quite reflective of Utah. So when we watch it here, I remember, did you go to the opening, like to the premiere?
To the premiere, the drive-through at the
drive-thru.
Triad parking lot
Yes.
with the roll-up, step and repeat red carpet and the
Which was
giant
fun.
screens. Sure do.
Like, that was amazing. And I
It was
think it
great.
just captured Utah in such a fun way.
Well, and the Housewives showed up to that in a really interesting way, too. Meredith and Mary were not there, but the rest of that first cast showed up and they rolled into the step of repeat. Jen Shaw showed up quite late, but she rolled up with an entourage, several cars, blowing horns, sirens, plastered Shaw Squad. Shaw Squad. But Shamazing hadn't, I think, been coined yet. And it brought this energy to a parking lot. And the reason it was in the parking lot was because the premiere was in December of 2020. So this was not, I think, what Bravo would have done for its typical premiere. This was not the low budget Salt Lake City thing. It was COVID, but it really did launch the show in a pretty unique way.
In a giant parking lot.
Giant parking lot.
That we have so many of.
Right.
And we have like the biggest city blocks in the entire country.
But across the street from the Delta Center, which with jazz tickets has become a pretty big talking point on the show with Lisa Barlow.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So there's these and if you're not from Utah, as we say, the Triad Center, you probably have no idea what we're talking about. But if you're from here, you can visualize this parking lot and be like, what? They did the premiere
in a parking lot
there? Yeah, it's like where you park to go to the Jazz games and the Mammoth games.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's this interesting, really, it's like going to local culture. That kind of paints this interesting picture. And these characters, did you talk to any of them when you were there?
I did not.
I was moonlighting as a freelancer for Salt Lake Magazine strictly so I could cover this event.
Yeah.
So I was working as a journalist and went up and talked to all of them. And it was fascinating to see how their personalities have evolved over time. Heather Gay was really kind of meek. She felt pretty uncertain. She felt certainly like she was putting kind of imposter syndrome out there. She was a lot more fresh in coming out of the church and kind of feeling what this would look like for her. I mean, if you remember, her season 1 tagline was something to the effect of like my pioneer roots, now I'm forging my own path. And to see where that evolution of Heather Gay has been really interesting. And I think that's true for a lot of the characters, but even more so for her. But I think it's really interesting to talk about this cast because at the time, when the Salt Lake City cast premiered, it was the most diverse cast that any of the Bravo housewives had seen.
Who would have thought Salt Lake City?
I know, right? So Atlanta had an all-Black cast with the exception of Kim Solsiak in season 1. But true diversity came from Salt Lake, like New York, Orange County, Beverly Hills. They were all largely white women in these shows. And Salt Lake premiered with a Black pastor, a Polynesian Muslim, former Mormon, 2 Jewish women. Well, Meredith Marks, who is Jewish, Lisa Barlow, who has Jewish heritage, but coins herself as Mormon 2.0, a traditional kind of former Mormon, and then, a woman in kind of Mormon in name only, but very Utah, right? Like, what an incredibly diverse cast. Am I missing anyone from that first season?
No, I think those were the 5.
Yeah, that's really...
Angie, and even Angie K later on.
Right.
Like someone Greek is very Utah.
Very Utah. I was born and raised Catholic in Salt Lake City, and all of the Greeks went to my high school. Catholicism and Greek Orthodox were very tight, right? So yeah, if you don't know much about Utah, you don't realize kind of that influence of Greek culture or of Polynesian culture, for example. And that's something that both Angie Castanevis and Jen Shaw brought to the show that really made it very local, very Utah. So let's talk about some of the stereotypes then. If you come in watching this show as someone not from here, what do you think some of the stereotypes people expect would be? And how does this show break them? We were talking about this a little bit when we first sat down.
I mean, in pop culture, I think it was you that were talking about this second wave, in a way, of fascination with Utah culture that goes back to Big Love. That probably was the first one, which I love Big Love. I thought it is such a good show. And this one, it's different in a way that it's yes, it's still somewhat Mormon, and I'm including Secret Lives of Mormon Wives into like this current fascination. It's very women centered too. Um, and it's about religion, but less so. And I think it's more about that somewhat of local Utah culture that we have here that can be fascinating. So my mind keeps going back to that and how maybe nationally tastes in TV maybe have evolved, or there's just something that happened that we were during COVID, because this also happened during COVID. I
Right.
always think about the Housewives happening during COVID.
Well, and
I
just
mean,
how we
Salt Lake
were
City.
all on our phones.
Yes.
We were all on, this is when I was introduced to TikTok. I had never been on TikTok before COVID, right? We were scrolling social media. It was a prime place to kind of discover some of these women and these personalities because
What
we
else
didn't
were
have a
we
lot to
doing?
do.
Yeah.
We were watching Tiger
Tiger
King.
King.
Yeah.
And some people were like baking bread.
Yeah.
And
I
think
never
a
got
lot
into
of
the sourdough. I was watching Tiger King and like doing
Same.
a deep dive into Housewives.
Same.
But it's interesting. So, yeah, going to that point, I think that Utah has always been this fascination point. And I would love your thoughts as someone who's not from here, Jordan. But Utah has always, we are a distinctly unique state. There's really no state that is quite as unique as the state of Utah. It was literally formed as a haven of refuge as Mormons were pushing west in trying, like from religious persecution. Like it was an entire religion that was formed here in the United States, a true homegrown religion, and an entire culture built around it. Even our landscape is representative of that history with the mountains that surround us, the cereal bowl of a valley that acted as a fortress, a protective barrier. So we're unique, and I think people have been fascinated by Utah culture for a long time. There's all those multiple wives and that polygamy thing, the not drinking. Like there's all these things that are very different than the rest of the country. And so I think that's been true really since the beginning. And then you had Big Love and Sister Wives that came out in the early 2000s that really tapped into the stereotypes of what Utah was, but put it into the Hollywood spotlight. And then 20 years after that, you have the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, and then later Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. Not doing that heavy lifting of stereotypes, but coming in with an expectation of what it might be and twisting the stereotypes almost immediately. I think one of the things that makes the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City fun is that they're actually really fun. Like growing up in Utah, and I don't know how much you saw as a teenager of this, but kids in Salt Lake are silly. They love to sing. They love to dance. They have these funny traditions of like people going and buying ice blocks and calling it ice blocking and sledding down hills on ice blocks or wearing wigs and dressing up. There's not a season goes by of this show where they don't dress up at least 3 times. Like they are silly and fun. They wore bonnets to make butter, right? And there's just this silliness in the show that I think is also really representative of Utah's culture. Because that's like how I grew up, asking people to dances with like candy bars and this big, massive display. I don't know if that happens everywhere.
I don't know.
Did you have that sort of like, did you ask people to prom with like these giant like scavenger hunts or like a dozen candy bars where you would be like, hey, big hunk, don't snicker.
I'm sure some people did. I didn't in my high school group. When I lived in Minnesota, they were crafty people that had to figure out how to be crafty in the freezing cold or burning hot temperatures. And so there is this very Minnesota vibe, like when you mentioned the ice blocks and rolling down the hill. Oh my gosh, in Minnesota, you get really, really creative. When you walk outside and your nose hairs freeze, you
Right.
have to figure out what to do to have fun.
Well, Minnesota loves some kitsch too.
Yeah, and so there's kitsch here too in Utah. So I feel that there's a similarity. And one of the things that I think piggybacks off what you're sharing, the biggest thing for me not being from Utah is that these housewives, yes, in some way they are incredibly unique, but in other ways they're just like the other housewives. I mean, and when I'm from Chicago, moved here for school. All of my friends were like, "Where are you going for graduate school?" I'm like, "I don't know." And I ended up falling in love with Utah and realized like Utah is a gem. Utah is an absolute gem. The people, the culture, the outdoors. But if you haven't lived here, if you don't know Utah, you kind of say what my friend said back in college, like, where are you going? What? And so I think the Housewives show this beautiful picture of, in some ways we are different, but in many ways we aren't different.
Because Bravo has a brand to hit too. The Real Housewives have to be a certain thing, right? It can't be totally different or it won't work as part of this franchise.
Yeah.
And so I think it does a really, to your point, a really brilliant job at leaning into the things that offer a real sense of place to Utah, but also are like women with the fancy bags and presenting as money. And I do also think that's one of the things that makes this show a little bit different than from, say, Beverly Hills, is that their wealth is not so out of reach. I think it's maybe aspirational, but it's not like so wealthy that it seems totally unattainable to a lot of folks. And I do think one of the other things that's really interesting, and Scott and I have talked about this quite a bit, is that the average viewer of The Real Housewives has at least a bachelor's degree, like more than 40 or 50%. It's a highly educated viewing group, which I think is really interesting when you talk about the conversations that happen like this and the huge amount of interest that there was in the symposium. We had close to 500 RSVPs, which, and of course, not as many people that RSVP'd showed up. But the fact that this garnered so much attention, that we got 500 people who were like, yep, I want to go to that, is really, really interesting. Because we very much presented it as an academic symposium. We had a list, like you're going to a conference, of all of the things that you would have for the day, and it was infused with a party, but it was certainly not presented as like BravoCon, for example.
Yeah.
So, Renato, are there any like major cultural things that you think the Housewives gets really right and also maybe gets wrong?
Oh my gosh, I'm going to be cheeky. Going back to the first season, Jen Shaw driving around with Stuart, and then they're circling Harmon's downtown for like half of the episode. It was the funniest thing because if you live here in Salt Lake City, that's just like 2 right turns and then you're in the parking lot. So they got that one really wrong. But then they just made him drive around in that little sexy car with like red seats. I just remember being like, are they just circling around Harmon's downtown 20 times? Some things that it gets right, I think, going back to the casting, I really love how they casted such unique women that are kind of representative or truly representative of Utah. Other things that they do right is all those little moments where they go to these places. And going back to that churning butter exercise that they did, that's a very Utah thing. And that's a very singular thing that happens in this state that it's funny to others that may not see it. But then if you see it from the eyes of someone from Salt Lake City, you totally get what they're doing and why they're doing it. I really enjoy that.
Because we dress up, Utahns dress up every Pioneer Day, every July 24th with bonnets and long dresses and hand cards. And there's a whole parade that is celebrating this culture from a very deeply Utah perspective. So then to see that kind of flipped in this really kind of campy and funny way on TV is like this hilarious little nod.
Yeah. And more than just a Utah perspective, I think it's a very singular Utah identity that's very much tied to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the pioneer history, that even the church itself is going away from that now that they're redoing Temple Square downtown. But it is such a fun introduction because I always view the Housewives as having so much camp. And, as a gay man, like I just love camp and campy things.
Full of camp,
and
right.
It's full of camp, and Utah is full of camp. So I feel like here it's just to the next level.
I wonder if there's any drag shows in Utah that have a cast of performers as someone of each housewife. I'd go to that show.
I'll go to that show too.
Okay,
So
let's work on it.
out, yeah.
Okay, let's make that happen.
Make it academic, and then you can.
Let's make it
From
academic.
your job description.
Okay, Scott, you on it? Excellent. Okay, stay tuned. But now let's move over to Jordan Rullo, who is a clinical
health psychologist.
I wanted to make sure I use the right word. So a clinical health psychologist who studies and engages in relationships. It's your whole thing, right?
Whole thing, yes. I'm a Gottman certified couples therapist. And for people who don't know Gottman, it's just a guy's last name, John Gottman. But he's done decades and decades of research following couples and really identifying what makes happy couples, what makes unhappy couples, And a huge component of what makes happy and unhappy couples is how they communicate. And there is a lot of communication in the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City.
Right. And these women spend so much time together. They're coupled or paired.
Yes,
or
it's not just romantic relationships,
Right.
it's dyads. And the housewives is just a mix of different dyads.
So your talk was so brilliant. And it's not recorded, I don't think, but it was so brilliant. Jordan did a great job at showing scenes and then breaking down the communication failings and successes, which were much fewer between these women. So can you kind of break down your process on how you presented this and maybe give an example or two?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe I'll back up just a little bit. One, I'll say this was the most fun presentation I have ever put together. And I'd been working on it since my proposal was accepted, like sometime in
November, yeah.
November. And then it was, all right, game on. So like evenings, weekends, I am just watching old episodes of The Housewives, trying to find these different communication examples and just watching the episodes. Like I've got my headphones on. I'm just cracking up rewatching these old episodes. So this was so much fun putting this talk together. But what I was looking for were these 4 specific communication styles that we know in couples research are the most damaging. And so the 4 are, I'll list them and then I'll explain them: criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. So criticism is when you attack someone, someone's character, not their behavior. So let's say someone leaves a bunch of dishes in the sink, your partner does, and instead of saying like, I hate when you leave all your dishes in the sink. Instead, when you criticize, you say, you are so lazy, always leaving your dishes in the sink. So you're attacking the person's character versus attacking or complaining about the behavior. So that's criticism. Defensiveness is you're defending yourself. You can defend yourself in a couple different ways. You can counterattack. Well, you always leave dishes in the sink. So that's the defensive counterattack. Or you can play the helpless victim and say, well, I can't do anything right. I'm always getting in trouble. So those are the 2 ways to be defensive. The third is contempt. And when I was watching these Housewives reruns, hands down, contempt was the most common. And contempt of these 4 horsemen is the worst. It is the most damaging. So let me describe contempt and then I'll share a little bit more about it. Contempt it's like criticism on steroids. You are saying things to your partner or to your friend in a way where you are acting like you are above them. They are less than you. You can think about the one word that I think really best describes contempt is disgust. I am disgusted by you. That is how beneath me you are. So that's contempt. And it can be verbal, like calling someone a name, or it could be rolling your eyes or like laughing and mocking the other person. So that is contempt. That is the gnarliest. When you see contempt in a relationship, and let's talk about housewives or in a dyad, that is one of the best predictors that relationship or that friendship is going to end. Because think about that. If one person is acting like they are better than or you are less than me, that is not a formula for a good friendship relationship. The other fascinating research around contempt is that when you are the one receiving contempt in your relationship or your friendship, you are more likely to get sick, to have more colds, more illnesses. It impacts your immune system. It's really damaging. It's incredibly abusive. And like I said, was absolutely the most common communication style I saw among the housewives. And then the last one of the 4 horsemen is stonewalling. And stonewalling is when you just kind of shut down. You're in a conversation and probably the tape playing in your mind is something like, you know what, this is not going to get any better. If I say anything, I'm just going to make it worse. So you shut down. And the longer that shutdown happens, it can elevate to what's called flooding. And flooding, physiologically, what's happening is there's a rush of adrenaline, there's a rush of cortisol, your heart rate's over 100 beats per minute, and you are in fight or flight. And someone can be flooded, they can look really calm. But if they had the heart rate monitor on, their heart rate would be over 100 beats per minute, even though they look calm. So, and you can look calm, but internally you can be flooded. And when you're flooded, you cannot think clearly. You cannot problem solve. The person you're talking to could tell you the funniest joke ever, and you are not going to find it funny. You are in fight or flight. And that's for Meredith. I'm disengaging. Every time she's disengaging, she is flooded. And we could talk more about how actually she's doing a great job when she disengages. So we can go into that. So those are the 4 communication styles. And some examples.
And I don't remember if this was an example, but
Yeah.
in that first communication style, remind me what
The criticism.
the criticism
Yes.
is. I just immediately think of season 1 where Jen Shaw said, "You're going to go with Mary, who bleeped her grandpa,"
Yes.
right? Like,
yes.
that's a great criticism, right?
Yes. yes. And this is where there's this fine line of, is that criticism? Absolutely. Or is that criticism on steroids? Is that contempt?
Right. And it's that great, like, to me, it's like, as you were talking about contempt, I was like, oh, maybe that's contempt.
Yeah, there's so much where even when I was creating the presentation, I'm like, ooh, is that criticism or is that contempt? I had a hard
Is
time
there a-
finding criticism because
Can you be guilty of two at the same?
Yeah. Is there a Venn diagram of criticism and contempt? Can you exist in that Venn diagram
yeah,
space?
that's a good. I'm sure you can. Yeah, I don't think the research has got that fine too.
Oh, well,
We are
we
specific
are going to
research on
find
the
to it here.
housewives.
Yeah.
Yes. So I mean, contempt is any of the. I'm not going to say it. But the gout comment.
The gout Richard Sucker.
The gout Richard Sucker comment that absolutely is contempt. Like, yeah, think about that. You're disgusting. You're so disgusting that you're a gout Richard Sucker. Like, I'm better than you.
That's also like taps into the humor. It's just the most ridiculous thing.
Hilarious. Okay, so that would be an example of contempt. And then let's go into Meredith's disengaging. Okay, so when someone gets flooded, like I said, you cannot, if you're having a conversation with someone, having an argument with them, you get flooded. Again, rush of adrenaline, rush of cortisol. You cannot think clearly. The conversation really you need to end it at that point because you're not going to get anywhere. It is not going to be a productive conversation. So what I teach couples in couples therapy, and this is what the research supports, is there's a 5-step flooding protocol. When you get flooded, you do these 5 steps. So let's say, what would be a good example of? Yeah, Meredith and Jen. This is the example I used in the talk. Meredith and Jen are arguing, and Jen, they were both flooded. Jen's getting up. Oh, this is when they were arguing about. A few of them saw Jen's vagina, and Meredith's like, "I saw your vagina," and Jen's like, "No, I have sons. You didn't say that." And like, "Moreno saw your vagina. We all saw your vagina." And they're screaming at each other about whether they did or did not see the vagina. And Jen's standing up, her fingers in Meredith's face, and Meredith's getting up. So they're both clearly flooded. So ideally, what you would do if you're in a situation where one or both partners are flooded is you stop. Someone calls a timeout. So you would actually call the word flooded. You can pick whatever word you want. But let's say Meredith says or Jen says flooded. Once that word is called, all action stops. So both parties have to agree that when that word is called, everything stops. So the way I describe this is like being in a hospital and there's a code blue that's called. If there's a code blue that's called, you don't finish having your coffee or finish having your conversation with your colleague. You stop everything and you run to that. So you call the word flooded. Second, all action stops. And sometimes what happens with couples, or I would imagine even with the housewives, let's say someone calls flooded and the other one's like, "But I just have one more thing I want to." Nope, all action stops. So all action stops. Then the third step is both people separate. So imagine if we could redo the scenario where they're screaming at each other about seeing Jen's vagina. They would call flooded, all action would stop, and then they would go in their separate areas. And maybe Jen would stay outside and Meredith would go back in the house. But you go in your separate areas. You cannot be around each other because you're seeing each other as enemy. So you go in your separate areas. And during that break, you have a guaranteed plan to get your heart rate down. So during that break, it is not about thinking, "Oh, I should have said this. And I knew I saw her vagina." Nope. During that break, you read a book. You listen to some music. You go on a walk. The entire plan during that break is to get your heart rate down. So what the research shows is for women, it takes about 20 minutes to get their heart rate down. For men, it takes about 30 minutes. So the recommendation is you take a break for at least 30 minutes. Then after 30 minutes, you both come back to the conversation. And hopefully you're not seeing each other as enemies and you can revisit the conversation. You know what? And here we go. This is what would be amazing if Jen said this. This would be a non-defensive way to respond. Jen might have said, "Yeah, I did. I wore a pretty short dress that day, and I think some people saw my vagina. Yeah, I'll have to be careful about that next time. Thanks for the heads up." That would have been a very lovely non-defensive way for Jen to respond about that comment.
But not great TV.
Exactly. And so this is another point I want to say about these communication styles. If all the housewives were communicating in a healthy way, and taking responsibility and just complaining versus criticizing and not having an ounce of contemptuousness and doing a lovely 5-step flooding protocol, no one would want to watch it. And the other piece is what floored me as I was putting this presentation together is if this is the only way they communicated, just those 4 horsemen, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, are so rampant. If this is the only way they communicated with these 4 horsemen, these relationships would not survive. These friendships would not survive. What the research shows is that you need to have a 5-to-1 ratio, 5 positives in your relationship for every 1 negative in order to just maintain a relationship. But the best relationships have on average a 20-to-1 ratio, 20 positives for every 1 negative. And I bet if you watched the Housewives episode and you coded their ratio, there's no way it would be 5-to-1. There's no way it would be 5 positives to 1 negative. Absolutely would be flipped. I think it's going to be more negatives to positives. You cannot maintain a friendship or relationship that way. It will implode. So one of the big takeaways that I have when doing that presentation is there's so much friendship, there's so much relationship, there's so much happening that we don't see on television, or there's no way that these women could maintain their friendships. And we're only seeing the worst and funniest parts.
Interesting. Well, and that also brings a lot of context to these other franchises as well, that they've had to disband, like New Jersey, for example. They just ended that because the relationships between these women were so fractured that they simply could not go forward with the show anymore.
So I wonder if those women, they weren't having repair. The relationships were not being repaired outside of being filmed.
Right. And there's other dynamics in that particular franchise because there's their family. Yeah.
Okay.
So you have like
That's an
actual
extra
like
layer.
sister-in-laws and brothers and
Oh.
a lot more complications into
Yeah.
it. Not the distantly related cousins that we have with Heather and Whitney. This session was so absolutely fantastic. I would truly, really love to see you come on to the show. And do you remember like first season where they had like a therapist? They were in Arizona or St. George or somewhere, southern Utah maybe.
I know.
And they were like on couches and Jen was there and they like had a therapy session basically.
Oh,
I think-
was it all the women? It was like a group therapy
Yeah.
session. I watched that, and
What were your thoughts on that episode, on that session?
that was not a session.
Oh, tell us more.
I mean, for my recollection, because this was a number of seasons ago, they all just started to argue in that session. And the type of couples therapy I do, no, like you as a therapist, you jump in. So the moment I start to see a session going off the rails or someone's flooded, pause, jump in, time out. I jump there's a huge portion of what I do as a couples therapist where I'm a little bit of a referee and a coach. So I'll jump in and say, oh, I'm hearing criticism. The antidote to criticism is to say how you feel and what you need. So I'm going to coach you right now. Let's do this differently right now. And then I watched that group therapy session and I don't remember really any kind of jumping in. It just
No, I don't remember.
turned into
that.
a mess.
That would be so fascinating to see that unfold, especially since, to your point, Meredith, in many ways, is the healthiest kind of approach that I'm disengaging and she walks away.
Yeah, that's her flooding protocol.
Right.
Disengaging.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, so much so that it's,
Jen Shaw's always flooded.
Jen Shaw has a lot of dysregulation. Yes. Yes.
yeah, fascinating. This session was so great because it really like, not only did you break down the show itself in this really like dynamic and funny way that everyone got, but I think that people learned a lot about communication styles, which was the goal, right? It wasn't just to talk about the Real Housewives, but actually to walk away with some learning and like feeling like you left the space knowing more than what you came with. And
Yeah.
your session completely just nailed that.
And I also I want to add another piece of it's interesting because where else, unless you go see a couples therapist or a friendship therapist, I don't even know if that exists, but a therapist that does.
Yeah.
How else do you learn healthy communication? If your parents or your family didn't model that, where else do you learn it? And maybe people aren't learning it. And what we're seeing are things like the Housewives. And really, my public service announcement would be do not take the Housewives as a model of healthy communication.
Right. Yeah. No, certainly. I don't know very many people who are like, that's how I want to communicate. That seems like the gold standard. Fantastic. Okay. Well, any thoughts, Renato? What did you take away from Jordan's session?
That you should be involved in contract negotiations for all the season. You could keep the show going for decades.
Oh my gosh, you have a side hustle, Jordan, that is emerging from this. Maybe a couple, actually. So fantastic. Okay. So one of the fun things that we did was we had folks gave the audience kind of a heads up that we're going to call volunteers to come and read their taglines. And there were some really, really fantastic ones. There was a woman who was like a seismologist who talked about earthquakes in her tagline. That was hilarious. There's someone who's talking about resting bitch face, and that was woven into her tagline. There were some really, really funny ones. Mine was something like, I teach the news, but I watch the drama.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I like that one.
So mine was, I don't throw shade, I annotate.
Oh, yeah.
But I also had a backup one. You've got your story. I've got your narrative theory.
So good. So good. Well, thanks to Jordan Rullo and to Renato Olmedo-González for being here. Thank you to Scott Black and the Tanner Humanities Center. I'm Marcie Cancio. And this was just fun. I want to go grab lunch and keep the conversation going.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you all for coming. You've been listening to the Virtual Jewel Box podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. Our music is by Jelly Roll Morton. Thanks for joining us.